Okay, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you here. I see there's only a few people so far, but hopefully more will show up very shortly. So Monica's here. Good morning, Monica. Good morning, Casey. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, Thika, or good evening, Thika. I know it's late for you. Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Good morning, Benamer. And good morning, Justin, as well. Jenna's here. Good morning, Jenna. How's everyone this morning? I think I think this might be officially the halfway point. I think we might be officially halfway done because it's a 12 week term. I think this is we're halfway through week 6. So I think I think this is it. I think we have officially hit halfway. Erica's here. Good morning, Erica. Good morning, Casey. Um, yeah, so this is the halfway point. You are officially half done, and we just have another 6 weeks, and then we'll be all done. But that's a long way away still. Hmm. So, what we'll do today, actually, how many people are here? 9. Maybe I will ask you this question. I might ask you the question again a little bit later. Um, but we're going to finish our racism unit this week. So we have a little bit more to talk about today in terms of Indigenous people in Canada. I have a little bit I want to talk about in terms of white supremacy in the US and in Canada to some degree. Um, and then that'll be it. And so what I wanted to ask you is there are there any racism related topics or racism topics that you would like us to deal with that we have missed, because we've definitely missed a lot, right? We haven't dealt with, racism is a huge problem. We haven't dealt with every aspect of it. We haven't dealt with every particular race or ethnicity or social group that might experience racism. We've just sort of dipped our toe in the pool. But is there something that's missing that you feel we really should address or we really should talk about? Um, what do you think? Hey, Ivan. Um, what do you think? Is there something that you expected we would talk about that we didn't, or that you really want to talk about that we haven't, or have we done a reasonably good job considering we don't have a lot of time? What do you think? Is there stuff that we missed that you want to look at, or do we feel comfortable with what we've done? Okay, so Casey says she's okay. We've covered the bases. So Banamere is okay, also good. All right. Um, that's coming up, Casey. The the little papers I gave you, I feel like I might want to modify a little bit what I expect out of those, and so I've just been kind of struggling with I've been kind of struggling with marking them because I want to, based on how I mark them here, I want to set you up for the next thing I want to do, but I don't want to. I can't tell you about the next thing until I figure this out, and so I'm just kind of stuck for the minute as on how to think about those micro papers because I think they're too small to do what I really wanted to do. Um, so I'm going to in the future I'm just going to change them a little bit in terms of what I ask, but I want what I ask in the future to be aligned with how I grade them now. So I'm going to try. I'm going to try to talk about those tomorrow. Unfortunately, I have a bunch of meetings after class today, but I'm going to try to. I'm going to try and get them back to you and talk to you about them either tomorrow or Friday for sure. But I just want to make sure that those assignments are in alignment and they're not confusing. And so, yeah, I just need to make some decisions about what to do. So they're coming back to you. They're coming back to you this week. I'm just sort of struggling with what to do with them. But don't worry, they look good. Yeah. So don't panic. It's just me trying to figure out what to do with them. Okay. Okay. So Karen says, I'm fine. I feel like we have a generalized view of most things. Yeah, you do. And I think, you know, most racism works similarly, right? So the group that is being the group that is the minoritized group that might be discriminated against, um, racism kind of works in the same way. And sometimes the stereotypes are different. Sometimes the groups are different. Sometimes the way in which they interact is a little different. But the sort of pattern and the way that these things operate in general are the same. Um, and so we're actually dealing with that right now, Karen. If you look in the United States, um, one of the things that we're seeing that's of course coming to a head and boiling over is racism against Black Americans. Right, we're seeing that very clearly. Here in Canada, we also have that particular issue, but we also have racism and discrimination against Indigenous people. Right, and Black Americans and Indigenous people are totally different groups. There are lots of things different about their history and their culture, but they still experience racism in their respective countries. And in some ways, that racism is a little bit different, and in some ways, it operates in a very similar way. So I think you're right. I think we do have a generalized view, and I think if you can understand racism against one group, you can understand it against any other one. Baha, good morning. Caleb, good morning. Okay, so sorry about that, Casey. I should have those back to you earlier. I apologize. That's not cool of me. It's not cool. But I'll have them back to you just as soon as I can by the end of the week. Okay. Okay. So let's jump in. Okay, people. Yesterday we were talking about again social construction of race in Canada and how um, the Canadian government and Canadians have historically used race as a way to ensure that some groups have power and privilege and opportunity, and some groups are denied those things, right? And of course, in this case, we're looking at Indigenous people. We walked through the history of Indigenous people in Canada. It was just a very short walk through, and we skipped over all kinds of things in the interests of time. But I think the picture that we got was that First Nations community have suffered at the hands of provincial and federal governments in Canada for quite some time, and as a result, many Indigenous communities are struggling with trying to physically survive, trying to economically survive, and trying to mentally or emotionally survive, right? And so we're seeing lots and lots of problems in some Indigenous communities, and of course it is connected to this history of colonialism. It's connected to this thing that has happened, this history that we share. Um, we read an article about the ongoing legacies of genocide in Canada, and of course, the question was, has there has there actually been a genocide in Canada? Can we say that? And of course, the author of the article, Pamela Palmater, she argued that yes, we have had one, and so she outlined in her article what a genocide is and what has to happen in order for an event to qualify as a genocide. And she suggests that that has happened here in Canada. That Canadian and provincial governments have done things that amount to genocide. Right? We said that some people might want to reject that argument. Right? It might be difficult for them to hear. Genocide is a very it's got a very negative connotation. It's got a lot of weight to it, and so people might not want to grapple with that idea, particularly in a country that they feel is, particularly in a country that's theirs and that they feel is, good and accepting and open. And there's also privilege can also be at work here too. And what I said yesterday was, privilege works in a number of different ways, and this is why it's difficult to understand the concept of privilege. And I think when we learned about it a couple weeks ago, we might have stumbled a little bit with it, because it gives you advantages and opportunities, but sometimes those advantages and opportunities are not obvious to you. And so, again, in the case of racism and discrimination, one aspect of privilege is that if you are in the dominant group, the dominant racial group in a country, you don't experience racism or discrimination, right? It's not pointed at you. You might see it, right? You might hear people say something racist, or they may discriminate in some way. So you can observe the racism, but it's not focused at you. And because of that, it is your privilege to ignore it, right? You can just distract yourself with other things and go on with your life. But people in minoritized groups who are the target of discrimination, those people can't ignore it, right? They don't have the privilege to be able to ignore that sort of thing. And so what I was saying here is that people might just not want to engage with this argument at all. And again, if they're in the dominant group, if they're white Canadians, they don't so much have to. They can just go on with their lives and not be affected by, or at least feel like they're not affected by, racism, right? We said that if we believe this, it might be more useful, because then we can take steps to solve the issue, right? You can't solve an issue that you don't admit exists, right? But if people don't believe and don't learn about this, then nothing changes, right? We continue to have an unequal society where some people are suffering and suffering significant effects of what's happened in the past. We saw all of those statistics, right? In that article, the author called on Indigenous people to step up, right? She said that we can't wait for the Canadian government to fix this. We can't wait for sort of white Canadians to fix this. Indigenous people need to step up and need to... Good morning, Manish, that's okay. Indigenous Canadians need to step up and set the agenda and talk about what they want and what they need in the country that they live in, right? And so that's kind of where that led us to this idea of reconciliation, right? How do we heal the relationship, right? How do we fix this relationship? How do we fix this relationship? I walked you through, or we grazed through a few milestones here that have shown that some progress has taken place in terms of fixing some of the inequalities that affect Indigenous people in Canada. But I also said that in many cases these haven't really amounted to much change. There was lots of promises. Particularly blah, 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 particularly when Justin Trudeau became prime minister in, I believe, 2015. There was a lot of promises that he was going to, reconcile and heal this relationship between Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians. I would say not too much has happened in that regard. A few things have happened. An inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women has occurred, but really not very much has changed. And so there is still significant work to do in terms of healing this relationship. And again, the relationship took hundreds of years to damage, right? It took hundreds of years to break. And so it's not something we can fix this year or next year or the year after. It's going to be a long process that we have to commit to. And nobody's really even sure what it looks like when we're done, right? We don't know what the destination looks like, even though we're trying to make the journey. So there's a lot of unknowns in terms of how to repair the relationship and how to restore some form of equality within Canadian society, but we're talking about it. And that's kind of the first step, is to have the conversation and talk about what has happened and then what needs to happen in the future. Okay. And that of course led us to part of this documentary called Eighth Fire. And so again, there's I forget if there's 4 or 6 parts to this series, this Eighth Fire series. We're just watching the first one though, and it talks about Indigenous people living in cities, right? So historically, Indigenous people were, or at least the government tried to create land for them far away from the cities and sort of stick them out there to be forgotten about. But as economic opportunities in the city have grown, it has attracted Indigenous people to the cities to live and work and sort of go about their lives. And so we have this kind of fusion of cultures here, a clash of cultures, maybe you could say. And Indigenous people are, in this video, they're talking about what their experience is within Canada and within Canadian cities, right? And what we're seeing, I think what we're seeing is that we really have a diverse group of people with a diverse group of experiences. And so, we've talked about in some of the statistics I've shown, or I've talked about, I've said yes, some indigenous communities suffer from lots of drug and alcohol abuse, domestic abuse, suicides, kids dropping out of school, all that stuff. There are lots of negative things happening in many indigenous communities, but there are also success stories, right? And so we've met a director of public health, I believe. We've met an attorney, a lawyer. We've met a successful animator. We're about to meet a very successful Canadian artist. So the experiences of Indigenous people in Canada are broad, right? And some people are stuck in very desperate, problematic situations. Some people have done very well for themselves and have successfully created a life. And then there's a bunch of people in between. And so the history of Indigenous people in Canada will affect all of those people a little bit differently. But we shouldn't, part of watching this video is so that we don't think of Indigenous people as sort of stuck in the past or sort of stuck in a museum somewhere. But it's also so that we don't think of Indigenous people as just as victims or as just the stereotypes that we heard at the beginning of the film, right? Because again, we have a very diverse group of people doing all kinds of different things, and again, we're seeing that in the video, I think. So Wab Kinew here is hosting, as we said, and I asked you a few questions. And so yesterday I think I had time to ask you the first question, what some of excuse me, what some of the stereotypes were that were surrounding Indigenous people in Canada. And so I think if I recall what you told me, um, there was there were stereotypes that they were kind of lazy, or that they were stupid, or they were, addicted to drugs or alcohol, or that they were all gang members, or that they none of them paid taxes, and they got free money from the government. And um, those stereotypes, unfortunately, are kind of alive and well in Canadian society. And we said most of them are negative, right? Most of those stereotypes are portray Indigenous people as portray them negatively. Um, but again, there are Indigenous people that are addicted to drugs and alcohol, and that are in gangs, and that don't have jobs. But of course, the stereotype assumes that that's their fault, right? That there's something wrong with these people, and that's why they are like that. But of course, that's not what we've been suggesting in this class, right? We've been suggesting that this long, brutal history that their ancestors have suffered through has kind of led these people to where they are. And so a lot of the social problems we see are connected to that history, right? And so, the stereotypes tell us, there's a little grain of truth in there, and you can certainly find Indigenous gang members, but they don't tell you the whole story, and they don't tell you why, right? They just take one little instance and they blow it up, and it generalizes to everyone. But again, it's not reflective of who these people are. The tax issue is another thing. There are some different tax laws that apply to Indigenous people, particularly when they're working on reserve. But it's it's not that they don't pay taxes or get free money from the government. Again, um, it's just not true. So we have a lot of stereotypes floating around. Most of them aren't true. Um, the animator, the comic artist, talked about the idea of the noble savage, right? And that's kind of a positive stereotype of Indigenous people too. And so this is kind of the Indigenous person as this kind of perfect, beautiful, but innocent human, sort of living in touch with nature and talking to the rabbits and things like that. And again, that's a positive one, but it's very basic and limiting as well, right? It's not based on reality either. And so yeah, so there's all these stereotypes floating around, connected with Indigenous people. Now here's the second question I asked you that I think we can answer. What did the video say about why are a disproportionate number of First Nations kids not finishing school? Because this is a problem, right? Because without a high school diploma in a country like this, you are going to struggle to get a job anywhere, right? So this is, getting a high school diploma is really only step one in a multi-step process to find a career. And if they're not making that first step, they're really going to struggle, right? So why are they not finishing high school? Do you remember? Do you remember? I think, let's see, Karen. So Karen says, yeah, they felt excluded in activities. Yeah. Let's see what else. I'm just gonna give this a minute and see if we can get some other things, and then we'll talk about that one. Okay, Karen? Okay, I gave it a minute. Yeah, so they felt excluded. So the idea here is that probably a couple of things. Um, One is that, again, those stereotypes, those sort of racist stereotypes, are still floating around in the back of people's minds in Canada. And so Indigenous people can often feel the effects of those, right? There can be little microaggressions and comments that can make Indigenous kids feel like they are different or less than or not accepted, right? The other part of it is that, even though they are one of the founder nations of this country, of Canada, they are often not represented in school curriculum very well. And so sometimes Indigenous kids can feel like, I think anyway, I might be wrong about this, can feel like, that they have been basically removed from history, right? That they are not part of the story of the country that they live in, when in reality they are, they're there in chapter one because they're here before any of us other people. And so I think it can sometimes feel like a social exclusion. Sometimes it can feel like a cultural exclusion, and sometimes it can feel like a historical exclusion, where they just feel that there's no place for them in school. That a school is, you know, that they're out of place in school, if that makes any sense. I think I might be wrong. Okay, and then last question. Last question. This was, you had to be quick to catch this one, but this woman, Lee Miracle, who was in the documentary, I forget what she does, but she says this. She says, what is Canada founded on? What's Canada founded on? Come on, people, take a guess. Okay, so Thika says that founded on immigrants and newcomers. Yes, so that is definitely part of the story, right? Because in many ways, Canada is a country of immigrants, right? Only First Nations people were here from the beginning, and so everyone else has come here as an immigrant. If you are non-Indigenous and you are in Canada, you are an immigrant. My family are immigrants. My family only came here in the very early 1900s, and so my family is a relatively recent arrival to Canada. Of course, I don't think of myself as an immigrant in this country because partly because of the way I've been socialized, but I am. But I am an immigrant here, and we all are. So, Thika, you're very right that Canada is, from one side of the story, we are a country of immigrants. So that's very true, and Baha, that's right here as well. Um, this is what Lee Miracle does say, though. She says that it's also founded on the negation of Aboriginal people, of Indigenous people, and that negation. So to make negative, to remove, right? So to negate something is to make it invalid or to remove it. That negation was done so that these people could be exploited, right? She says, Lee Miracle says there's a certain amount of dehumanization happening. And dehumanization is important because, again, human beings usually don't like to hurt each other, right? We're not monsters, even though sometimes we act that way. And so sometimes what happens is if you're a government or a leader in power and you want one group to treat another group really badly, you need to make the other group less than human somehow. And so sometimes you use propaganda to sort of make these other people seem like terrible, awful monsters. Sometimes you use propaganda to make them seem less than human. And when you do that, it makes it much easier for you to treat them poorly and take their things, right? And so in the US, during slavery and even after, we saw that happen with Black Americans, where there were stereotypes that suggested that Black people were just not as intelligent, not as hardworking, just not really capable of, you know, operating at the same level as white people were. And of course, that's ridiculous and totally wrong. But the stereotype allowed white people in the US to feel better about keeping Black people in slavery, right? So, because they were dehumanized, they dehumanized these people. And Lee Maracle says the same thing is happening here, or is happening and happened here in Canada as well, that Indigenous people were made Canadians saw them as less. They saw them as primitive, they saw them as savage, they saw them as not as civilized, not as intelligent or cultured as Europeans. They saw them as less, right? And so that sort of dehumanization, seeing someone as less than human or less than you are, makes it much easier for you to mistreat them and take their things, which is exactly, of course, what happened. Canadian government mistreated Indigenous people and took their things because they were denying their humanity, right? They were negating Indigenous people. Okay, so there are a few more questions to answer here, 4, 5, and 6, and there's more video to watch. And so what I'd like you to do is watch the rest of the video. Let me just check how much of the video is left here. There's about 30 minutes left of the video. 30 and 40. So can I let you watch the rest of the video? Can you answer the rest of the questions for me? Everything is still in Microsoft Teams from yesterday, so you can just go back there and find the link. You'll watch from, we stopped at 15 minutes yesterday, so start at 15 minutes and then go to the end, and then we'll come back here and we'll talk about the questions. So you'll need a half an hour to watch the video, 10-minute break after that, and then we'll come back. And so that'll put us around, how about 9:25, we will meet back here. We'll have watched the video, and then we'll talk about the answers, okay? So 9:25, be back here. I'll put a timer up on the screen so that you'll know. The links are still in Microsoft Teams, so go back to the second video, watch from 15 minutes all the way to the end, answer the last few questions, and then we'll talk about it at 9:25, okay? So I'll see you in just a little bit. Enjoy the rest of the video, okay? Okay, good people, and we're back. At least I hope. So that might have been just a little long, but hopefully you were able to finish watching the video. Hopefully you were able to answer some questions, um, and hopefully you had a little break. I think you probably had enough time to do that. What I wanted to ask you before we sort of dive into the official questions is I just wanted to ask you what were some of your reactions to what you saw in this part of the documentary. So we met Kent Monkman, the Aboriginal artist, and so he paints and he does performance art um, with his sort of transgender, um, fluid sexuality, character Mischief, right? So we saw a little bit of that. Um, we met who did we meet? We met a lot of people. We met a teacher who teaches, I think, in Aboriginal education in college. We saw the hip hop guys. We saw Winnipeg's Most again. We saw, who else did we see? That young artist Herb Varley, doing sort of an art exhibit of his photographs. We saw him and his father, and how his father is kind of struggling in the downtown east side of Vancouver. We met Jordan Tutu, who's a NHL hockey player. I'm not sure where he plays now. He used to play for Nashville Predators, but he is an Indigenous person from kind of the far north of Canada, from Nunavut. Who else did we see? Gosh, we saw a lot of things. We saw a daycare where young Indigenous kids and non-Indigenous kids are kind of learning and playing together. So, or a preschool or a daycare. We saw that. Yeah, we saw all kinds of things. What did you think? What was interesting, or not what you expected, or kind of cool, or what do you say? Oh yeah, we met the two elders. Yeah, so the guys from Winnipeg's Most, John C. and did Brooklyn go, or no? I don't think Brooklyn went. It was the other guy. I can't remember his name. The two guys from Winnipeg's Most. They went. Yeah, they went to talk to some elders, and we should probably point out that um, here in the West we don't give we don't give quite as much respect to older people as maybe we should. We are in the West here. We're much more of a youth focused culture than an elder focused culture. But of course, many cultures around the world um, do give a lot of respect to elders, and Indigenous people are one of these cultures, right? A lot of um, knowledge and skills come from the elders, right? So those guys went and spoke to those two women. Um, okay, so that's nothing you want to say. We should just dive into the questions. Okay. So, first question I asked you was this. So, we met Kent Monkman. That was right at the beginning of the video today. He's um, a very well-known artist in Canada. Again, as I mentioned, he paints. He's done a lot of very famous paintings, but he also does performance art as well. And so, Karen here says, "Oh, okay, this is your reaction. Sorry, Karen. Let's do that." Sad and happy, hated the police officer and his excuse, and I liked how the Indigenous people were teaching their culture. Okay, cool, 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 cool. So yeah, so we see, um, especially in what's going on now, when um, we're kind of reevaluating, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada, we're reevaluating the role in which police, the role that police play in our communities, but also how the police operate. And so we see an interaction here between these indigenous guys kind of hanging around, and the cops show up and talk to them. And um, that's kind of interesting, right? Because I can hang out wherever I want, and cops don't show up and talk to me, right? And yet they showed up and talked to those guys. And so um, it's not the first time that the cops have talked to them about things. And so you can see that tension, right, between police and between indigenous youth, right? And again, it's very reflective of what's happening in the US right now. Yeah, and you can see there's a number of different people who are trying to communicate indigenous culture, right? Whether they're artists, whether they're teachers, um, whether they're performers, or whether they're running a daycare, right? There's a um, strong desire to begin transmitting culture again, right? There were a number of programs and laws in place to try to destroy that culture. Didn't work, and indigenous people are now sort of reclaiming that and sort of beginning to transmit it. So yeah, I think I agree with you there, Karen. There's a bit of sad, and there's a bit of happy. Yeah, I mean things are not fixed. Things are not fixed yet, but good things are happening, right? Um, okay, so good. So how does Kent Monkman's art oppose the colonization process? So Casey says it breaks stereotypes and boundaries with his videos and paintings with themes of sexuality and mischief and ego. Yeah. Um, Part of what, actually, I'm going to go to Thika's here as well. Thika says it's wiping out colonial stories. Baha says he drew a settler looking at an indigenous person, not as usually shown in the movies or drawings. Yeah, all of these things. So part of this might be a tricky concept, or it might not be, but part of the history of sort of indigenous people have been portrayed, they have been shown in Western art. And when you do that, when a Western artist paints a scene of an indigenous person on a horse hunting a buffalo, like we saw, we're seeing indigenous people through the eyes of Westerners, through the eyes of Europeans. And so because the European is painting that photo, the European is the one who gets to say what the indigenous person is, right? They are defining the indigenous person as the West sees them, right? And so in art history, if you take an art history class, this is sometimes referred to as ethnographic gaze. Okay, so the gaze is like the look. So whose eyes are we seeing this person through? And Kent Monkman is saying that a lot of art that has to do with indigenous people, where indigenous people are depicted, it's seen through the eyes of Western people. It's seen through the eyes of colonizers who came to North America, kind of took over, and now we are showing indigenous people as we see them. And Kent Monkman is saying, no, 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 I'm going to show you what I see when I look at you. And so he uses so he is a sorry, I'm going to grab this one here. He's sort of breaking these stereotypes by using the art style of these Western artists, but he's showing you things that are kind of bizarre, right? And he's trying to show you the colonization process and settlers through the eyes of the indigenous person. Okay, so he's kind of switching who's doing the looking. Instead of colonizers and Western Europeans looking at indigenous people, he's turning it around and he's saying, I'm an indigenous person, and when I look at you, this is what I see. And so you see lots of very subversive and strange kind of images in his photos. And he also talks a lot about sexuality as well. And so part of his identity is, that he's an indigenous person, but he's also a gay man. And so he is using his art to talk about sexuality. And so we haven't talked about this yet because we did these units in a different order. But when we talk about sex and gender, which I think we will do next, um, we'll briefly talk about the idea that indigenous people were more accepting of different genders and sexualities than Western culture is. And so indigenous cultures sometimes had a third or a fourth gender. So people who didn't fit into the category of man or woman, they were kind of somewhere in between. They were more accepting of different sexualities. But Kent Monkman says when Western Europeans came to Canada, they didn't understand or accept those things. They thought there was just two genders and there were just heterosexuals. There was no homosexuality allowed in sort of the Western cultural idea. And so those Western ideas got imposed onto indigenous people, and they weren't allowed to express themselves as they would have traditionally. And so Kent Monkman's not only talking about who's looking at who and how indigenous people have been seen and how indigenous people now see colonizers, but he's also talking a little bit about he's trying to bring back a sort of a definition of gender and sexuality that's more in line maybe with indigenous cultures than it is with Western cultures, if that makes any sense. So he's doing some pretty complicated things with his art, but um, he's been super successful, and people like to pay lots of money for his art. I asked you this: how do people become trapped in places like Vancouver's downtown east side? So I'm gonna sneeze here in a second, I think. So I'll let you answer that while I sneeze. Okay. How do people become trapped in communities like Vancouver's downtown east side? Um, for those of you who are in Vancouver, if you've ever been to that part of town, you'll know that it's not the nicest place. It's probably not a place that you would want to live necessarily. Um, but some people kind of get stuck there, and Herb Varley's father, whose name I can't remember, Mr. Varley, he's had some trouble kind of escaping from that area of the city, right? And so KC says because of failings in society like proper education, not enough opportunities in workforce and housing. Yeah, um, so Herb's we I presented you with the statistic that about 30% of indigenous kids aren't graduating high school, right? And Herb Varley's father was probably one of those, and so didn't graduate high school, went to work on a fishing boat, came back. Now he's in Vancouver, which is a very expensive city, as probably you know, and he doesn't have a lot of employment prospects, right? He doesn't have a lot of skills. He's been working on a boat. He doesn't have a high school diploma. What can he do? Well, there's obviously not a lot of support for him, right? And so he's going to experience discrimination and racism, but he's also going to find that there maybe aren't a lot of programs or resources to help him. And so, yes, so he might not have a lot of money, and so the downtown east side might be the only place he can afford to live because again, Vancouver is an expensive city. There's lots of stereotypes surrounding him, and there's drug addiction too. And so, if he struggles with a drug addiction, which it sounds like he does, and he has to live in the downtown east side because it's the only place he can afford, well, that's a problem because there are lots of drugs available in that part of town. And so, he can walk out his front door and probably find drugs very quickly. And so if you're trying to stay clean, if you're trying not to take drugs and yet they're everywhere around you, that's going to be even worse, right? That's going to be a struggle. And so he can't even move away from those problems because they're right outside his door, right? And of course, unemployment doesn't help, because not only can you not pay for the things that you might need, not only can you not use money to sort of improve your life, but you're going to start to feel bad about it, right? You're going to start to feel bad about who you are and where your life is going, and if you have any chance of success, and if you're even a worthwhile person. And all of those feelings can lead you into depression and anxiety and maybe even drug addiction, right? And so these things they all feed off of each other, right? Thika says, yeah, because they can't get jobs and they don't get along well with them. Yeah. Um, yeah. So the unemployment thing is a problem, right? Because if there are lots of stereotypes and discrimination against Indigenous people, guys like Herb Varley's father may not get a job, right? They don't really have the qualifications that most people want. They might not have the experience that some people want. People may discriminate against him because he's an Indigenous person. Therefore, he's unemployed. Therefore, he can't move to a better part of town where there's less crime and less drugs. Maybe he can't buy himself nicer clothes so that when he goes into an interview, he, presents a better image. All of these things are kind of feeding off of each other, and it makes it very difficult for him to leave. And especially if there's a drug or an alcohol addiction involved, those things can make it impossible for you to get a job, or to keep one, right? People who have drug addictions tend not to make very reliable employees, and so they may not be able to keep their job because of their drug addiction. And so all of these things are kind of connected, and they sort of just make things worse, and they keep people stuck in a particular part of the city or in a particular situation that they can't seem to escape, right? And as we saw in the video, Herb Varley's father, Mr. Varley, he kind of always has a plan to sort of get out of this lifestyle in this part of the city, but he never seems to be able to do it, right? Which is sad and heartbreaking, right? Because it's not it's not really all his fault, right? There are lots of barriers that keep him from getting out of that lifestyle and getting out of that part of town. And so the last question I asked you was this. I said, Canada's First Nations people are a living culture, right? They don't belong in history. They don't belong in the museum. They are a living, modern culture, but a culture in recovery. And so what are some of the ways in which we see First Nations people kind of reimagining and reclaiming their identity and their culture? So there's all kinds of stuff throughout the video. How do we see Indigenous people redefining who they are and reclaiming and redefining their culture? So Thika says here, First Nations people by watching related movies. The one woman we met in the video there, Nakuset, that movie was a catalyst for her, right? She was an Indigenous child who was taken from her family and was adopted by a Jewish family, right? And so she kind of always knew that she had Indigenous heritage, but it wasn't really a part of her identity. And then she saw this very popular movie in the 1990s called Dances with Wolves. It's actually not bad. It's actually worth a watch if you want to watch it. But she kind of rediscovered a piece of who she was, right? And so that led her to re-engage with her culture, redefine who she was. She changed her name. And that movie was sort of a catalyst, right? It was a spark for her to re-engage with her culture. Yeah, so that's good. Sometimes movies can do that. They're teaching other people about their culture. So Um, and we probably see that in a few ways, right? There was the teacher, Ron, oh gosh, I'm going to forget his name now, Linklater. He's actually a teacher, and so he's teaching people, and we saw a classroom of recent immigrants to Canada. They're learning about Indigenous culture and Indigenous history in that class. So he's directly teaching people about his culture. But there's other ways too. Um, Kent Monkman is doing it as well, because when people see um, his art inspires conversation, right? You see his art and you like, we have to talk about this. What's going on here? And it starts the conversation. And so in a way, Kent Monkman is a teacher too, because he's putting images out there, and those images make people talk, right? They make people ask questions, they make people say their opinions, and then people can learn from that, right? How else? Other ways in which people are reclaiming their identity and their culture. How are they reclaiming? Just looking at this bubble now, it looks like Sesame is actually saying this, but it's not. The guys from Winnipeg's Most, we could say, are also doing that, right? They're using hip hop, right? They're using rap. They're using an art style that comes to us from the United States, that comes to us from the Black community, but they're kind of borrowing that and they're using that to communicate their experience, right? They're talking about what they've been through in their lives and how they see themselves, and so they're using music and particularly hip hop to communicate to people what they're about, right? What their culture is like, what their experience is like. Um, Garen says, yeah, giving their children Indigenous names. I think Nakuset talks about that. Um, she's engaging with her culture, and she's identifying her kids as Indigenous, right? So she doesn't want them to hide who they are, or be mistaken for someone or something else. She wants them to very clearly be Indigenous kids, right? And so that the name is part of that. Um, Casey says, hoping their kids have proper work. Um, yeah. I think we see a lot of that through the video, is where people are engaged in sort of redefining their culture in all kinds of different ways, right? Through music, through art, through comic book art, through daycares, through just plain old teaching and education, um, shelters for women, all of these ways in which Indigenous people are kind of reimagining and redefining who they are. And so, um, the culture definitely started out somewhere in a particular environment context, sort of in nature. Um, those people were pushed aside, and Canada was completely changed. And now they're trying to reimagine and rediscover what their place is in this new situation, and how can they be who they were, but also who they are at the same time. And maybe the last thing I'll say, because we only have another minute to talk here, is that the process that we see those people going through in this video, I think, is very reflective of what we all have to do as a country, right? So these Indigenous people are trying to figure out, how do I fit into modern society? How do I be who I am in this kind of new context, this new Canada? And I think that's the question that we all have to ask, is that how do we give these people, how do we allow these people space to be who they are within Canada, right? What does that look like? And that's a question that I think nobody has the answer to yet. That's something we haven't figured out. But the good news is that the conversation is happening. You can see, even just in this video, you can see people are doing things, they're reclaiming their traditional identity, and they are reimagining what it is to be an Indigenous person in Canada. Whew, okay, so we're totally out of time. So that's it. I will end it here. Tomorrow we will review this really quickly, this sort of Indigenous people in Canada thing. Then we'll move on to white supremacy. Okay, so I'll let you go. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating, those of you who did. And I will see you in either 10 minutes in comparative cultures, or I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so thanks. See ya.